Dr. Frank Thielman, welcome to Theology U, where we talk to academics and authors about God and faith in a way that anyone can understand. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Will. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, we're talking about a book that you just wrote that came out, I think, in March of this year called Paul, Apostle of Grace. It is, from what I can tell, in some ways a magnum opus of your long career of doing Paul studies and New Testament studies. I've enjoyed getting to look at it so far, and excited to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your interest in the book, and it is the result of a number of years of teaching and study. I sort of had my students in mind, I think, as I wrote it, and hope it will be useful as a textbook.
I'm fairly positive it will. My first question to you is a general one. Who is Paul? How would you describe who is the Apostle Paul, and what his message was at its very core?
Well, Paul is a really significant figure in the history of early Christianity. He wrote the documents that are actually the earliest witness that we have to the Christian church. So he wrote 13 letters, and these 13 letters comprise a fairly sizable chunk of the 27 documents that take up the canonical New Testament. And he gives a very clear description of what Christians call the gospel, the good news, in his letters. He tells us why the good news is necessary. He tells us what's good about it. And the thing about Paul is he was really transformed himself by this good news. And you can sense that transformation, gratitude that he has for the gospel all through his letters. So his letters are these very authentic documents. I mean, they're exciting to read because you feel like you're just getting a glimpse into this person from the first century Roman world who was really transformed by this message of good news about Jesus.
Yeah, he's definitely a big deal. I know his 13 of the letters claim, or that they name him as their author. But I know there's lots of debate. I think it's 7 that scholars will agree were definitely Paul, and then there's 6 that people will suppose maybe it was people pretending to be Paul or some other thing. Could you give it quickly gets into extreme technicalities, which we don't need to do here, but could you give a little overview of why people question that Paul wrote all 13 of these, and then why you are fairly confident that it was Paul who wrote them all?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. Well, it is true that in the ancient world, the forgery of documents was a fairly common practice, especially forgery of documents by famous people. So Paul quickly became pretty famous in the Christian world as a result of his widespread ministry. So it would not be surprising if people wanted to write in his name. And scholars debate whether or not documents were written in Paul's name sort of in good faith. In other words, by people who thought they were extending Paul's message in the way that he would extend it in new environments, or whether that's really unlikely and documents written falsely in Paul's name are just forgeries. So there's a debate that goes back and forth about that. And there is a pretty vigorous debate still among scholars about the authorship of the 13 letters that bear Paul's name in the canon of the New Testament. You're exactly right. 7 of those letters are accepted pretty much by every interpreter of Paul. 6 of the letters are more disputed. Among those 6, 2 Thessalonians is sometimes thought to be by Paul. Among people that would question other letters, the same is true of Colossians. I'm among those who think that all 13 of these letters are authentically Paul's. And the reason I think that, it's a complicated question, but basically the reason I think that is that the witness to the Pauline authorship of these letters is very ancient. It goes way, way back. And these letters, they have a different character than letters that are not in the canon that are attributed to Paul. They look somewhat different than those letters. So the question really boils down to how versatile you think Paul's writing style is, whether he could use different vocabulary in some letters than he uses in others. It boils down to how comfortable you think Paul was in the world of Hellenistic moral philosophy. A lot of the moral instruction in First and Second Timothy and Titus, for example, bears a strong resemblance um, to the kinds of things that Hellenistic moral philosophers would write. And how comfortable was Paul interacting in that world?
Hellenistic philosophy, which Dr. Thielman mentions, refers to philosophy during the Hellenistic period, which began after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and ran until around 30 BC. We don't have time here to go into this philosophy in detail, but it was a really influential period of philosophy, and many ideas which originated in this time, like Stoicism, are still really important to people today.
I think Paul would have been very comfortable in that world, and I think he might very well have written in a somewhat different way to his two close co-workers, Timothy and Titus, than he would write to large groups of Christians in his other letters. So a lot of this just boils down to how convincing you think the arguments are that Paul couldn't have written in a somewhat different style and in a different way in some letters than he writes in others. And I just find the arguments more convincing that his style was versatile, and he could write in a number of different ways depending upon the context.
Yeah, it's a complicated topic, which is interesting, but also gets very technical quickly
Yeah,
based on
yeah,
the language and, like you said, the surrounding culture. So if people are
right.
interested, definitely read more about it. There's plenty of literature about it. I just thought it'd be interesting at least to get that overview for someone who maybe has never heard that people are suspicious that Paul wrote all these letters. That there's the debates are
Mm-hmm.
ongoing.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Could you talk about Paul's early days? I think most people are familiar with his kind of conversion experience, Jesus appearing to him
Mm-hmm.
and saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then Paul has this change of heart. Could you talk a little bit about Paul's life before then? Because he doesn't get a lot of attention in the biblical account before then. So could you just give us a little background on who he is?
Sure. Be glad to do that. Well, there, of course, isn't a lot of information about Paul's really early life. There is a little bit of information, though, in the book of Acts, where we learn that Paul was born in Tarsus, that he was a citizen of Tarsus, which probably means that his parents were citizens of Tarsus as well. Tarsus was a really important city for a number of reasons. It was an important commercial center, so there were people there that it had a very large port nearby. So there were a lot of people in Tarsus who would have been there for a few years and then moved away. They were there for economic and commercial reasons. It was also a center of great learning. So Tarsus would have been like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New Haven, Connecticut, or Oxford, or Cambridge, England. It was a university town, sort of, and philosophers had lived there, very famous philosophers, and philosophy was a topic of discussion. And so it's entirely likely that Paul got a very good education there, both in Greek and in Greek language, Greek reading, some Greek literature, and philosophy. Now, Paul tells us that he was a Pharisee, and his family seems to have followed Pharisaic traditions as well. And they seem to have been very conservative Jewish people living in the diaspora, so living outside the land of Israel. And so they probably would have limited Paul's education to things that were not offensive to Jewish people. So I doubt that Paul, went to see many plays by Euripides and Aeschylus, in the amphitheaters. I mean, he might have had some exposure to those things, but he probably had a fairly typical conservative Jewish upbringing. And then eventually, when he was a young man, he went to Jerusalem. And some of his family, apparently his sister, lived in Jerusalem, because there's a reference in the book of Acts to his nephew, who was the son of his sister and lives in Jerusalem and helps Paul out at one point. So he says in the book of Acts that he was a student of the very famous Rabbi Gamaliel. And Gamaliel's well known outside the New Testament. And he's mentioned a time or two in the book of Acts, and his wide influence is also mentioned in the book of Acts. The interesting thing about Paul, though, is Gamaliel seems to have been a very reasonable, level-headed, peace-loving Jewish teacher. Paul, on the other hand, prior to his conversion, was a zealot. He was filled with zeal for the Mosaic law, and zeal that sometimes turned violent. So to that extent, he wasn't like his teacher Gamaliel, but the fact that he studied under Gamaliel was a rare opportunity. Gamaliel was a famous scholar. So Paul was quite learned, both in Judaism and in Greek literature and language. A very unusual person, actually, for his time.
Yeah, I think that's good to know. Especially in those days, he wouldn't have had, this wasn't like a big class of people, correct? It would have been
Correct.
like he wouldn't have had very many students.
That's right. Yeah. So, I don't know exactly how learning under a rabbi like Gamaliel worked, but
Sure.
my guess is Paul, he only accepted a certain number of students, and Paul would have been one of the few. So I think you're right about that impression. Yeah.
And so it seems like his teacher may have actually been reeling Paul back all along. I wonder if Paul didn't, if he didn't get this extreme, in the New Testament we see him persecuting the early church extremely, more than anybody else. You think he didn't pick this up from his teacher? This seems to be more his personality.
I think so. Yeah. And when his persecuting activity was going on, I think he was probably a fairly young man. If you do the chronological work, he was probably in his 20s. So I think he probably had a lot of zeal, and he was, locked into a very particular viewpoint, but he probably did not have enough experience of life yet to kind of have more empathy with people. And who knows? I mean, we shouldn't psychologize him. We're looking back at him, from 2,000 years, and we can't get into his head. But it is easy to imagine somebody with a lot of knowledge and very kind of rigid viewpoints coming down hard on people in a way that, had he been somewhat older, he might not have done.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of confidence too.
Yes.
In his way of viewing the world. I think what it does do is it says something about the power of his conversion experience, because of how, like you're saying, how set in his ways he seems to be from a young age, and then has this complete 360.
Yeah.
I think what it does do is say this was a really powerful experience, when Jesus reveals himself to Paul.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I get my next question. You use a lot of sources in the book, kind of putting together Paul's life. Probably the most frequently used source is the book of Acts. When you're doing kind of a historical work like this and relying on the biblical text, how can we know that, like the book of Acts, for example, is a reliable source of historical information to do a historical project like what you're doing in the book?
Yeah, well, it is, you're right. It really is important to think about how reliable the documents that we use for sources, how reliable those documents are in constructing a life of anybody if we're writing a biography. And there are some scholars who would say, well, it's not very reliable. There are some scholars who would say it's more of an ancient novel. It has some of the characteristics of the kind of storytelling that ancient novel writers engaged in. There's a lot of travel narrative in the book of Acts, and that's a characteristic of ancient novels. But I think Acts, and for that matter, the Gospel according to Luke, these two books seem to have been written as two volumes of a single work. I think they actually look a lot more like the kind of historical writing you find with Thucydides or Herodotus or Josephus, these well-known historians. Josephus himself was Jewish, who wrote in Greek, just like Luke did. And if you look at the characteristics, the literary characteristics of Luke and Acts, they bear a lot more similarity, I think, to those ancient historical writers than they do to ancient novelists. Polybius is another history writer. And ancient writers of history had a robust sense of what was nonsense and what was factual. They were not gullible. And they knew that there were people who claimed they were writing history, but did not, in fact, write history accurately. And they were aware of that. And I think Luke has all the characteristics of a historian who is aware of other historians that don't write history well. And he's trying very hard to give an accurate account. You can see that in his preface to the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4 or so, and then in the opening to the book of Acts as well. And then another reason I think that we can rely upon Luke as an accurate historical source for Paul is that several times in several passages in Luke, he uses the first person plural. He says, we did this and we did that. He does it in chapter 16, in chapter 20. He does it in chapter 21, and again in chapter 27. So he has these places in the narrative, and they are all places where this person who the narrator identifies as we, this person is with Paul. And so it seems like the narrator is alerting us that he actually accompanied Paul on a number of the adventures, including that great story of the shipwreck in Acts 27, on a number of these adventures that Paul was engaged in. So if that person is Luke, and Paul himself in his letters does mention a co-worker named Luke. He does this in Philemon, which no one doubts is written by Paul. He does it in Colossians, where he calls Luke the beloved physician. Now, some people would say Colossians was not written by Paul, but I think there are very good reasons for thinking Paul wrote Colossians. And he refers to Luke in 2 Timothy and says that Luke is with him. In fact, he says Luke is with him in all of these places. So Paul himself gives testimony to a person named Luke, who was his co-worker and was with him in parts of his ministry. Luke has these we sections, these first-person plurals. I think that it's very probable then that the ancient church identification of the book of Acts author as Luke is correct, and that Luke was a companion of Paul, and therefore able to interview Paul on events in his life where Luke himself was not actually there. So if Luke was a companion of Paul sometimes, then there would have been opportunities for him to ask Paul about the parts of his life where Luke wasn't in the picture. So I think there's there's really good reason to believe that Acts is a faithful record of Paul's ministry, and I use it that way extensively in this book. And then, of course, Paul's letters are also very important firsthand sources for Paul's own life. He does speak autobiographically at several places in his letters. And so that information is really important. And in the places where the book of Acts matches up with, in other words, the places where Paul in his letters mentions ideas about his own life or events in his own life, you can often match those up with the book of Acts, and they correlate
Mm.
beautifully. And really surprisingly, often in seemingly insignificant details, they will correlate with one another in
Mm.
ways that would just be very unlikely if the author of Acts were making all this up. So I think there's really good reason to use Acts and Paul's letters as primary sources for his life. Then you can fill in a lot of the historical and cultural detail by using Josephus, the Jewish historian,
Mm-hmm.
and Philo. These were these were people who were almost contemporaries with Paul. Josephus would have been a bit younger than Paul. Philo was an almost exact contemporary of Paul, and they wrote extensively, both historical documents and documents that have a little bit more of a, well, with Josephus, it's mainly historical. Philo writes some historical documents and a great deal of sort of philosophy. But they're both Jewish, and they both wrote in Greek, and they both wrote right at about the time that Paul lived. So you can fill in a lot of the cultural information from Philo, Josephus, and others
Mm.
as well. So,
Okay, thank you for that. That's
yeah, that's helpful.
helpful, and I think just
Sure.
good context to have. When you're trying to think about writing a biography 2,000 years later.
Yeah.
So thanks for saying that. For the rest of our time, I'm going to ask you just some random questions that kind of pop throughout Paul's book of things that I think people listening will be hoping to get answers for when they click on an episode for Paul.
Sure.
The first one is the thorn in his side. It's the impossible question.
Yeah.
You mentioned an illness that pops up for Paul several
Hmm.
times in this book. Do you think that illness could possibly be the thorn in his side that Paul's always talking about? Do you think it's something else? I'd love to just hear, your
Sure.
thoughts on what
Yeah.
that might be.
Yeah. Paul refers to a thorn in the flesh, he calls it. So,
Hmm.
we've probably all had the experience of having a thorn in our flesh. It's very unpleasant. And often it's hard to get it out. If it's a splinter or something, it's hard to get it out. So it's very distracting, very unpleasant, not necessarily life threatening, but just really unpleasant. And I think that that's the kind of thing Paul's talking about. And of course, nobody really knows what it was, but eh, there are some indicators in the way Paul describes it that it was a recurring illness of some type. He says that 3 times he asked the Lord to remove it from him. So, what does that 3 times mean? Well, the number 3 was often used as kind of a round figure for just frequently. And I think it could mean that Paul frequently had to ask the Lord to remove this ailment from him. And then he tells us in his letter to the Galatians, he says to the Galatians how grateful he is to them for the way they treated him when he arrived among them.
Hmm.
He says that he originally preached the gospel among them because of an illness. And then he says, you did not, and usually English translations euphemistically translate the word, he says, you did not despise me. But the word in Greek is, you did not spit at me. And sadly, in antiquity, often people spat at people with obvious disabilities and ailments. And Paul was grateful that the Galatians didn't treat him that way. At
Hmm.
the end of Galatians, he tells the Galatians that he bears on his body the marks of Jesus. And We don't know exactly what that is. It seems like it has something to do with Paul's treatment and abuse, violent treatment and abuse. Maybe when he was arrested, when he was stoned, maybe these things left scars. But it's really likely that Paul was a person who knew what chronic suffering was all about, and
Mm.
whether it was from the violent treatment he had received, from a recurring illness of some type. But he tells us that he appealed to the Lord to remove this from him, and the Lord's response was, "My grace is sufficient to you, for my power is made perfect in weakness," which I think means that the Lord did not remove uh, this thorn in the flesh from Paul, but used it in Paul's life to help Paul be a more effective, perhaps a more empathetic and sympathetic
Mm.
proclaimer of the gospel. So,
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The way you just explained it makes me think that maybe this was something he picked up. You know, maybe it wasn't illness, maybe it's something entirely different, but something that he picked up post conversion. I wonder if this was something that came about after his, after he
mm-hmm.
converted to Christianity, and now it's giving him a hard time. And he says, "Man, it'd be a lot easier to do this evangelism thing if I was, if I was healthy or whatever it is."
Right.
So I feel like that's a helpful way to explain it,
Yeah,
um, at least for me. But the unending question, we'll have to wait for the next life to get the answer to that one.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah.
I warned you these questions were going to be random, so we're going to jump now to Ephesus
Okay.
and Artemis, the god of Ephesus, or the goddess of Ephesus. So could you talk about the cultural background of the city of Ephesus and why it matters in Paul's life?
Yeah. So Paul spent a long time in Ephesus, between 2.5 and 3 years. So he was there for a really long time. And Ephesus was the capital city of the largest province in the Roman Empire. The province of Asia was the largest Roman province.
Interesting side note, if you're able to pull up a map, the ancient province of Asia is probably not where you think it is. It's actually in western Turkey, using modern political boundaries, an area which Paul was in quite often.
And Ephesus was its capital. It was a large, flourishing port city with a very important port. So there were people there who spoke all kinds of languages, who were engaged in all kinds of different cultural activities,
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of food and clothing and all that kind of thing. But one thing everybody would have had in common, pretty much, would have been a certain amount of awe for this massive temple to the goddess Artemis that had been in Ephesus for centuries. Artemis was an interesting goddess. She was identified in various ways, but she was basically a fertility goddess, a goddess of hearth and home. Um, she was also a goddess who could make life miserable for people who did not worship her correctly. And one of the interesting things about Ephesus was that it was a great center of finance and banking. And the reason for that is that funds could be deposited in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus and pretty much be guaranteed to be safe from any kind of theft or robbery,
Mm-hmm.
because people had such fear of what Artemis would do to them if they tampered with those funds. And Luke in Acts 19 has this amazing story of how Paul came into conflict with people that earned their living by making little shrines. We don't know exactly what these were, but they were perhaps small silver models of the temple in Ephesus that tourists to Ephesus purchased, and they were cultic objects. So people would bring them home, put them on the mantle, and worship them and sacrifice to them, say prayers to them. Um, and So many people became Christians during the 3 years that Paul was in Ephesus that the sale of these items began to drop off, and the trade guild that made them began to suffer economically, and that's what got Paul into trouble and led to the big riot that Luke describes in Acts chapter 19. So Artemis was a very important part of the culture and of the world of people who lived in Ephesus. And it's just so interesting that Christianity had such an impact on the city that people were afraid the gospel was going to damage the reputation of that city as the guardian of the goddess Artemis.
Hmm. Yeah, people will tolerate a lot until it affects their ancient bank
Yeah,
accounts, right?
absolutely. Yeah,
Suddenly things get real.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so I find that a helpful thing, that just reading the biblical text, there's no way to pick that up, but it's like essential context that I think is good to know for anyone reading the book of Ephesus now, or interested in it. I would say it's almost worth going back to it, or do some more research, go back to it and see how that's impacting things. Another random context thing that I think is interesting is from 200 years earlier in the 2nd century BC, so like 200 years or so before Jesus. Jewish people were banned by the powers that be from performing circumcision, which was is becomes a big debate in the early church. Do we need to keep circumcising new converts to the faith? But I found that historical detail from 200 years earlier to be interesting in understanding why this was such a big deal. Could you talk about history behind that, and then
Sure.
kind of trace it into the early church?
Yeah, be happy to. And you're exactly right. That was a very important event in the history of Judaism that eventually had an impact on early Christianity. So circumcision had been for centuries a critical rite within Judaism. It's described in Genesis chapter 17 as this sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. So for many, many centuries, Jews had practiced circumcision as a rite that was distinctive for their people. Now, there were other people groups that also practiced circumcision, but for Jews, male circumcision was practiced as a very particular rite that was a distinctive marker that they were God's people. Well, in the 2nd century BC, a Syrian king rose to power who exercised control over what we would call Israel today. And his name was Antiochus IV. He had a moniker added to his name, Epiphanes, which means God manifest.
Hmm.
And nobody knows exactly why Antiochus IV did this, because it was something quite unusual within the ancient world. But he decided that he wanted basically to erase the distinctive markers of the Jewish people. Um, why he thought that these markers were a threat to his rule, we don't know, because people in the past had uh, not found this to be the case, or it to be helpful to try to persecute a religion based on its distinctives. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes basically thought that all Jewish people needed to be seriously Hellenized. In other words, they needed to start worshiping Greek gods. And among those gods would be, of course, the most important one, the god Zeus. And Antiochus IV identified himself with the god Zeus. And so he found Jewish people in the Jewish nobility who were willing to compromise their Jewish heritage and serve as high priests, and set up an image to the god Zeus in the temple precincts. He had swine's flesh offered to the god Dionysius within the temple precincts. And of course, Jews considered pigs to be unclean. They never ate pork. And the thought of sacrificing swine's flesh within the temple precincts to a pagan god, that was about as low as you could go in religious terms for most Jews. And he outlawed circumcision, and he outlawed the keeping of the dietary laws, and the keeping of the Sabbath, these three great distinctives of Jewish religion. The Jews successfully fought back, and a guerrilla movement rose up against Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Judas Maccabeus was the great leader of that rebellion and successfully recaptured the Temple Mount and rededicated the temple. And that event is celebrated to this day among Jewish people as Hanukkah. And, at Hanukkah time, they retell this exciting, adventurous story with Judas Maccabeus as the great hero of the story. Well, as time went on, by the time we get to the first century, circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and the dietary laws of Judaism began to be more and more just the three main distinctives of Judaism. And people were also very concerned about the loosening of these distinctives, because they were well aware of Jewish people in high places who were willing to compromise their faith for political or economic expediency. And so lots and lots of people were really wary of anybody who sought to downplay the importance of circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and dietary restrictions within Judaism. And this may be one of the things that really got early Christians into hot water with some Jewish people who were quite zealous for keeping the boundaries of Judaism intact. And I think it's what led to the council in Jerusalem, the meeting in Jerusalem of the apostles, and also of some Pharisees who had become Christians, who believed you had to be circumcised in order to belong to the people of God. It led to a great deal of conflict in early Christianity. And it led to Paul explaining that the gospel is all about God's grace to people, that we don't have to do anything like keep circumcision food laws and the Sabbath in order to win God's favor, but God has done everything necessary to be a part of his people through the death of Jesus on the cross.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear. It's easy to look at this like intense pushback that no, everyone needs to be circumcised. We need to uphold these laws, and think, like, what is the big deal? Why
Yeah.
is this so sensitive? So
Yeah.
I think that context is really helpful, as well as, like you said, this commitment to upholding the law of Moses. You have this concept of, they have the laws, and Paul is presenting this new covenant. Um,
Mm-hmm.
could you talk? I guess my last question would be: could you talk about, given Paul's like intense Jewish background and deep knowledge of the scriptures, how he explains this, like what has happened? Because, like you said, we're moving on from, we're letting some of these things go, like circumcision for the
Mm-hmm.
Gentiles. We're letting some things go, but a lot of things are still the same. And he's seeing Jesus as kind of a fulfillment, a continuation of his Jewish faith, the culmination of it. Could you just talk a little bit about like what that movement is and how Paul articulates it? And
Sure.
yeah, anything else that comes to mind as we wrap up our time?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Yeah, I think Paul really sees the good news about Jesus as a continuation of the story that began in Genesis 1-3. We have this story in Genesis of God creating this wonderful, beautiful world and placing his human creation within that. And then his human creation rebelling against God. But God, in his mercy, not rejecting that human creation, but then working through a particular people, the people of Israel, to eventually bring forth a great king that would renew God's creatures and his creation. And as part of that renewal, a really critical part of that renewal was that uh, people needed to be forgiven for their rebellion. So, through the death of Christ on the cross, God forgave people of their rebellion against him. Another really important event that the prophets talk about is the coming of the Holy Spirit. So, God's Spirit then would also come in the time of the restoration of his people in the new creation. God's Spirit would come and indwell people and help them to live in a way that God created people to live. And so Paul saw what he was doing in proclaiming the gospel as announcing just the really good news that God was restoring his creation and his human creatures to what he intended for them to be at the beginning. He was forgiving their sins. He was announcing his merciful intentions. And I think Paul would probably stop me right there and would say, you know, Frank, your tendency is to only say the things that are gracious and merciful,
Hmm.
and not also to say that the gospel rescues us from God's judgment. And I would have to say, you know, Paul, you're right. That is
Hmm.
not a very comfortable message. I don't like talking about it, but Paul talked about it. And he said, you know, Paul, it's very clear from 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, that when Paul preached the gospel, he preached that there would be a time when God would remake this world so that it was free of oppression and injustice and sin and rebellion, of people being horrible to one another and being ungrateful to him, and that time would be a time of judgment. And before that time of judgment comes, we need to seek God's forgiveness and the restoring work of the Holy Spirit. And so I think that's what Paul viewed himself as doing as he preached the gospel. He just zoomed all over the Mediterranean world,
Hmm.
proclaiming this urgent message of good news and of God's mercy, but also that it was necessary to embrace it before judgment came.
Yeah,
So,
emphasis. I
yeah,
was gonna say emphasis on the urgency.
yeah,
He
that's right.
one of your framing questions is what prompted Paul to be so urgent and to
Yeah,
take these treacherous
yeah,
journeys. I mean, this travel was not. You look at a map today and you think, okay, he's going here, he's going here. Today it wouldn't be that hard to do this, but you think
yeah.
a lot of this was on foot or
Oh,
on
yes.
boats, which I mean, he gets shipwrecked the whole thing.
Yeah,
um, which again, kind of like how his conversion, how like his zeal speaks to the power of his conversion. I feel like his urgency and his nonstop travels speak to the level of conviction he had that what he was saying was true, that it was good
absolutely.
news, and that he wanted everyone to know about it, and he thought he was running out of time.
You're
Um,
you're exactly right. That's right on target. And it is so instructive to pull out a map and see the distances that Paul traveled, and then to think about him doing this. I mean, traveling by sea so frequently in
mm,
an age before there were compasses. I mean, there was no compass. So people navigated by the stars. And if you were out in the Mediterranean and the clouds rolled in, you couldn't navigate. So ship travel was treacherous, and people frequently died of shipwrecks. And Paul was involved, he tells us this, in a number of shipwrecks. He traveled on foot. He was in danger from rivers, in danger from robbers. You know, he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Why did he do this? I can't think of anybody in the ancient world who did this kind of thing. You can just, read and read and read ancient writings, and I can't think of anybody that
Mm-hmm.
was quite like Paul in what he did. Why did he do it? Because he had
Mm-hmm.
experienced this wonderful transformation of the gospel himself, and he wanted to share it with others. So,
Yeah, and I mean he was successful. I guess you could
yeah,
read that as the Holy Spirit empowering him and protecting him. He
absolutely.
gets shipwrecked, but he doesn't. It doesn't ever take him that off course, and eventually he gets back on track, and he keeps
Yeah,
doing the same thing. He avoids.
absolutely.
I know he gets arrested, he gets beat up, but he has this persistence,
Hmm.
and he just goes and goes and goes to the point where I think at one point he says it would be easier for me to go be with God now, and yet I have
Yes.
more work to do. It's
Yeah.
almost like he wishes he
Philippians
could.
1.
Yeah,
Right.
he's like I'm kind of over this, but
Yeah.
like I'm still here, so I have to keep going.
Absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
Um, well, thanks so much. This has been really helpful. I thank you for your patience with my erratic questions. Paul's life is deserving of probably 50 episodes of this show. So thanks for touching on a couple things that
Oh,
I thought were interesting for doing the research for this book, and
thank you,
for coming on
Will.
the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Your questions were very good questions. Thank you for taking the time to interview me and for your interest in the book, and I hope it's helpful to others.
Of course, it's Paul, Apostle of Grace, published by Erdman's just a couple months ago. Dr. Thielman, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Will. Bye-bye.